Hello, and welcome to Backer Breaks It Down. In this episode, we are going to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And the way that we do that involves the definition of parallelogram and or any of a parallelogram's properties, okay? So if you can show that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, you can say the quadrilateral is a parallelogram by definition of parallelogram. If you can show that one pair of opposite sides is parallel and congruent, you can prove parallelogram, okay? But it has to be both parallel and congruent. You could prove both pairs of opposite sides are congruent, or that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, okay? Or if an angle is supplementary to both of its consecutive angles, that's what they're showing you here. They're proving that angles A and B are supplementary and A and D. So they're saying that on angle, they're talking about angle A there. And then lastly, you could prove that the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other, and thus the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. Okay. So here we have some quadrilaterals. We want to pay attention to the markings on their diagrams showing us congruences and or parallel lines. And we want to determine, is the quadrilateral a parallelogram? And if it is, we should be able to match it to one of these. So feel free to pause, try these 5 problems, and then unpause to see how you did. Okay. Or continue watching and I'll talk about them. Okay. So when I look at A, I see that this diagonal has been split into 2 congruent parts. I see the same thing in the other diagonal. So diagram A is a parallelogram, and it's a parallelogram because of reason F, the diagonals bisect each other. When I look at quadrilateral B, I see the markings on these 2 sides. Okay, and those markings are telling me 2 things. The tick marks are telling me the 2 sides are congruent. The arrows are telling me the 2 sides are parallel. So this is definitely a parallelogram because one pair of opposite sides is parallel and congruent. For C, I see that the tick marks are indicating that the opposite sides are the opposite sides are congruent. Thus, we have a parallelogram. Reason B, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. When I look at D, I see that QU is congruent to AD, and I see that UA is parallel to QD. Okay, D is not a parallelogram. Okay, if you were thinking it was, okay, in B, this is where like we had one pair of opposite sides that was parallel and congruent. So it was the same pair of opposite sides. In this quadrilateral in D, like we don't have that. One pair of opposite sides is parallel, one pair of opposite sides are congruent. It's not the same pair, so this is not a parallelogram. And then lastly, quadrilateral E. Okay, so at first glance, you might have thought that this is not a parallelogram, okay, because they only indicated that one pair of opposite sides was parallel, and then they told you that a pair of angles were congruent, okay? Well, those congruent angles actually prove something, okay? Let me trace them out. So here's angle UAQ, and here's angle DQA. If you're seeing the letter Z and thus thinking about alternate interior angles, excellent. Because, yeah, angle UAQ and angle DQA, I should say, are alternate interior angles that are congruent. And so what they prove is that, sorry about that, is that UA is parallel to QD. So this quadrilateral in E is a parallelogram by definition. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Okay, so that's something to be aware of, right? Especially those alternate interior angles, because yeah, you throw in one of the diagonals, you're going to get alternate interior angles, and they can be used to prove parallel lines. So just something to look out for. Okay, and so those are the ways that you can prove a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So you can use the definition where both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. You could prove that both pairs of opposite sides are congruent, or that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, that the diagonals bisect each other, that one pair of opposite sides are parallel and congruent, or that an angle is supplementary to both of its consecutive angles. If you can do any of these things, you can prove a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And that is how Backer breaks it down.